remember when I was in a Christian school of very different theological persuasion than I now hold as a youth. I was reading through Romans, and it was really gripping me, passages like this. And I remember asking in Bible class, who is this man? I asked the teacher. I had already kind of proved myself to be a little bit on the obstreperous side, asking questions and sort of probing. I was working through this stuff, and you didn't like a lot of questions or challenges, and so I asked, who is this man? And at this point, I was crying because I was desperate. I wanted answers not for intellectual curiosity, but for my salvation. This teacher had told us if we were walking along from school and had a dirty thought and Jesus returned, or we got hit by a car before we could confess that sin, we'd go to hell. I was in mortal fear. And so I said through tears, who is this man? I want to be that man. The man to whom the Lord will not impute guilt. And he said, it's the man who lives according to God's commands. It's the man who confesses his sins before Jesus returns, or he gets hit by the car. It's wonderful news to go back and actually read the life of David and realize that that's not the answer at all. Children don't grow up to be David. And yet he's called a man after God's own heart. Loved by God because God didn't impute his guilt to him. He imputed it to Christ. Christ got David's sin, and David got Christ's righteousness. And that's true for all who believe, the Apostle Paul says. This is absolutely foreign to our moral psyche, and we just have to realize that. See, this is the danger of saying, I get the gospel, now let's move on to the Christian life and how I can have a better marriage and so on and so forth. Not unimportant questions, but it is fatal for us to think that we can ever move on from the gospel. You can't even deal with the difficult circumstances in your marriage, which, let's face it, you'll have until glory, apart from the gospel. The gospel, because it answers deeper questions, actually has more to say about the important but secondary questions as well. It's totally counterintuitive to us. Our default setting is, I'm basically good deep down. I do some bad things. I have bad hair days morally. I know I've done some terrible things. I can think back in my past, say, I wish I had never, if I could take that back, if I could do that over again, but deep down I'm a pretty good person. At least my heart is right. But Jeremiah says the heart is desperately wicked above all things, and who can know it? And Jesus said, your heart, it's out of your heart that all of the evil stuff you do happens. My heart is more sinful than my hands. My heart has accomplished sins my hands haven't gotten around to yet. No, the deeper you go, the dirtier it gets. Deep down, I'm actually worse than you think I am. The heart is desperately wicked. You say, well, but God comes and he heals it. God heals our heart, and we become righteous over time. And God says, well, you're not perfect. Who is? But at least you're on the road. At least you're trying. At least you mean well. And this ignores the fact that God actually has to have a perfect righteousness. Anyone who stands on his holy hill had better have perfect righteousness on for his clothing. It's a dangerous thing to fall into the hands of a living God. And so this message is totally counterintuitive. We have to hear it over and over and over and over again. Because every sentence of what Paul says here, which we don't have time to unpack, every sentence that he says here, which is the heart of the gospel, is totally counterintuitive. You can't just be an American and walk in off the street and get this. It's not something that 50% of Americans just already believe. You ask people on the street, what is religion? What's the purpose of religion? Well, they say, well, it answers the question of our moral guilt before God so that we can stand in his presence and be adopted as his children instead of condemned on the last day. I think that's what your average person is going to... No, they say, to help us be better people, to help us have more love and peace in the world, to help us with our relationships, to help us with our struggles, to improve our lives and our self-esteem and the way we relate to each other. It's totally counterintuitive to be told, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. But to the one who does not work, but trusts him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. That is totally counterintuitive. According to all of the recent surveys, 3/4 of the American population believes all good people go to heaven when they die and all bad people go to hell. 3/4 of the American population. More people than those who believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And a vast majority, 87% of America's professing evangelical Christians said, in the matter of salvation, God helps those who help themselves. If you try hard, God will take notice. It's the message of Joel Osteen throughout his books. That's the basic drumbeat. God will notice. Every kind thing you do, God will notice, and he will put something back in your bank account. Well, that is totally contrary to the logic that Paul is setting forth here. Here, God puts all of his riches in your bank account with one condition, that you be ungodly. That you acknowledge that you haven't a penny to your name. God credits, God imputes the righteousness of Christ to you through faith alone. And this is the hardest thing in the world to believe. This is harder than all of the good works that we could ever perform to try to merit God's favor. And that's why it's a gift from God. It is a miracle that any one of us here tonight believes this. An absolute miracle.